3 months behind. You've got 72 hours to clear out. My daughter is in the hospital. I just need 2 more weeks. Not my problem. You should have thought about that before falling behind. She has a heart condition. She could need surgery. Every tenant has a story, Reed. Yours isn't special. I'll find a way. No, you won't.
Victor Hale had been delivering that particular brand of certainty for years, the kind that comes from knowing a man has nothing to fight back with. No savings, no connections, a sick child, and a job that could disappear at any moment. Victor had seen dozens of tenants in Malcolm Reed's position, and he knew how it ended every time. Quietly, with boxes in the hallway and a forwarding address that led somewhere smaller. What Victor did not factor into his calculation was the walk Malcolm had taken the night before 2 miles in the rain, carrying a stranger on his back, to an address Victor would have recognized immediately. What had Malcolm set in motion without knowing it? If you've ever helped someone when you had almost nothing left to give, this story is for you. Subscribe to the channel and stay with this. What happened next took less than 48 hours to unfold, and none of it went the way Victor planned. The eviction notice was still on the kitchen counter when Malcolm left for his evening shift 2 days later. He hadn't moved it, not because he'd forgotten it was there, but because moving it would mean deciding what to do with it, and he hadn't arrived at that decision yet. He was working on the problem the same way he worked on most problems, by keeping his hands busy with something else, and letting the back of his mind find the edges. Malcolm Reed made his living by showing up. That was the whole of it, really. The warehouse job during the day, and the moving and repair work in the evenings weren't skilled labor in the way that commanded respect at a dinner table, but they required a specific kind of person, someone who came when they said they would, worked at a pace that didn't need supervising, and didn't make other people's problems bigger than they already were. Malcolm was that kind of person. He had been that kind of person for a long time, and it had kept them housed and medicated, which were the 2 things Lila needed most, and the 2 things he had organized his entire life around providing. Lila was 9 years old, and had her mother's eyes and her father's habit of not asking for things she suspected she couldn't have. The heart condition had been diagnosed when she was 2, a structural problem with one of the valves, the kind that could be managed with medication and monitoring until it couldn't be, at which point a surgeon would need to go in and correct it. The cardiologist had been clear that the surgery wasn't an if, but a when, and that the when would be determined by how quickly the valve deteriorated. Malcolm had kept every appointment, filled every prescription, and paid every copay on a timeline that sometimes required eating less himself, so the pharmacy bill didn't push them past the edge of the month. The eviction notice was for 3 months of arrears. He knew exactly why they were 3 months behind. He'd taken 4 unpaid days off when Lila was hospitalized in February, which had pushed the rent, which had pushed the electric bill, which had pushed everything else in the slow-motion cascade that happens when there's no buffer. Victor Hale had sent the notice 2 weeks after the last late payment, before Malcolm had even had a chance to request an extension. That was Victor's pattern. Move quickly, give people less time than they need, count on the fact that most of them will be too exhausted to fight back. Malcolm was exhausted. He wasn't too exhausted to fight back, but he hadn't figured out yet what fighting back looked like in this particular situation, which was why the notice was still on the counter. The rain started around 6 in the evening, while Malcolm was walking the 12 blocks between the bus stop and the warehouse where he picked up the truck he used for evening jobs. He didn't have an umbrella, the good one had broken in March, and the replacement had gone missing somewhere between the apartment and Lila's school, so he pulled his jacket tighter and kept moving. He had a delivery scheduled for 7:30 and another at 9, and if he moved at a reasonable pace, he could get both done and be home by 11, which would give him 6 hours before the warehouse shift started. He was 2 blocks from the bus stop when he saw the man. Theodore Grant was sitting at the covered portion of the transit shelter, which provided roughly 18 inches of protection from rain that was falling at an angle. He was bent forward at the waist, one hand pressed flat against his sternum, the other gripping the edge of the bench. His breathing was audible from 10 feet away, not the normal breathing of someone who had hurried to catch a bus, but the effortful, catching kind that happens when something inside is working too hard. Malcolm stopped. He looked at the man, then at the other people near the shelter. 3 of them had phones out. One was watching with the specific expression of someone who wanted to be seen not getting involved. The bus shelter was a public space, which created a diffusion of responsibility that Malcolm was familiar with in the abstract. The more people who could help, the less any individual felt obligated to, but he had never been particularly susceptible to it. If he was the person closest to a problem he could address, he addressed it. This was so deeply habitual that it didn't present as a choice. He crouched down in front of the man and asked if he was all right. Theodore Grant was not all right. He was 73 years old. though Malcolm didn't know that yet, and his blood sugar had been dropping for the past hour in the way it did when he'd missed a meal and pushed himself past what his body was still willing to accommodate. His phone had died somewhere between his last appointment and the bus stop. His wallet was in the car, which was somewhere on the far side of the city with his driver, who had called twice and then lost service. Theodore knew his home address, and he knew it wasn't far, and he knew that what he needed was his medication, which was there, and his glucose tablets, which were also there, and that neither of those things was available to him at the moment. He explained this to Malcolm in fragmented sentences, stopping twice when the coughing came back. He said his house was about 2 miles east. He said he had a caretaker who would be there by 7. Malcolm looked at the time on his phone. He looked at the man. The bus came 6 minutes later. Malcolm had already called the emergency line and been told the wait was substantial. Multiple accidents across the district because of the rain, and this call was categorized as non-critical because the caller wasn't reporting a cardiac event or loss of consciousness. The operator asked Malcolm to keep the patient warm and comfortable and said they would send someone when they could. The bus driver opened the doors, took one look at Theodore, and said he couldn't have passengers who appeared to be in medical distress on the vehicle. He said it in the practiced voice of someone reading from a policy rather than making a judgment, and he closed the doors before Malcolm could finish the sentence he was in the middle of. The bus moved on. The 3 people with phones had spread out. The person who'd been watching had found somewhere else to be. Malcolm looked at Theodore. He looked at the direction the man had indicated, east, 2 miles, with a caretaker at 7 and medication waiting at the other end. He thought about the delivery at 7:30, which he would miss, and the client who would be annoyed, and the evening's income, which was not optional. He thought about all of that in approximately 4 seconds. Then he crouched down, told Theodore to put his arm around his shoulders, and stood up. 2 miles in rain on a cracked sidewalk with a man across your back is not a thing that resolves quickly into meaning. It's just weight and distance and the sound of your own breathing. Malcolm counted blocks, because counting blocks gave him something to hold on to when his legs told him to stop. Theodore was lighter than he'd expected, which was its own kind of information about how little the man had been eating. He set his pace at something sustainable, not hurrying, because hurrying would make him careless, and he wasn't going to drop this man on a wet sidewalk because he'd been impatient. Theodore talked intermittently. He asked Malcolm's name. He asked what he did. When Malcolm gave the honest answer, warehouse days, moving and repair evenings, 9-year-old daughter at home, Theodore asked if the work was steady. Malcolm said steady enough. Theodore didn't push, which Malcolm appreciated. There's a kind of question people ask about difficult circumstances that is really a request for you to perform gratitude about your own hardship, and Theodore wasn't asking that kind of question. He was asking as someone who was genuinely listening to the answer. The soles of Malcolm's shoes gave out somewhere around the final quarter mile, not catastrophically, but enough that he could feel the wet sidewalk through the right one. He kept walking. The house was at the end of a tree-lined street in a part of Greenfield that Malcolm drove through occasionally for deliveries but didn't think about much. The exterior was understated in the way that certain kinds of money present themselves, not flashy, just permanent, the kind of construction that suggests whoever built it wasn't in a hurry. There was a camera mounted above the gate and another above the front door, both angled to cover the approach. Malcolm noted them without attaching significance to them. Cameras were cameras. He helped Theodore to the door. Theodore produced a key from somewhere in his coat and opened it. Inside was warm and dry, with the particular quality of a space that had been maintained carefully over a long time. Theodore pointed toward a cabinet in the hallway and told Malcolm what to bring. Malcolm brought it. He waited while the older man took his medication and sat down, because leaving before someone was stable seemed like leaving before the job was done, and Malcolm didn't leave before the job was done. Theodore's caretaker arrived at 7:10. She asked a number of questions in the efficient manner of someone who had done this before, and Theodore answered them, while looking at Malcolm in the doorway with the expression of someone who was doing math about a person. Theodore offered money. Malcolm said no. Theodore said at least let him call a car. Malcolm said he'd take the bus. Theodore said the least he could do was cover the fare. Malcolm said the fare was covered and picked up his jacket from where he'd draped it over a chair. In the small exchange that happens when 2 people are working out how to part after something unexpected, Malcolm mentioned Lila. He wasn't being strategic about it. It came up because Theodore had asked about the evening's lost income, and Malcolm had explained that evenings mattered because daytime flexibility mattered because his daughter's appointments were unpredictable, and he needed to be available for them. He mentioned the heart condition the same way he mentioned everything about Lila matter-of-factly, because it was a fact and not something to be managed around in conversation. Theodore asked for his name again and his address. He said he wanted to send something a note, a proper thank you. Malcolm gave them because refusing would have been strange, and because he assumed, reasonably, that a thank you note was what it was. He walked to the bus stop on a shoe with a split sole, called the client to apologize for the missed delivery, and rode home through the rain. What happened after Malcolm left Theodore's house belongs to the hours he wasn't present for. Theodore sat with his caretaker through the rest of the evening, ate what she brought him, and thought about the address Malcolm had given. He had grown up in Greenfield. He knew what the address Malcolm had given meant in terms of the building, the management company, and the conditions that most of its tenants navigated. He had not thought about that building specifically in years. He set the address aside for the morning. Malcolm came home to find Lila unconscious on the floor of the apartment's small hallway, a bottle of heart medication tipped over beside her. He called emergency services while he was moving, giving the address and the details the dispatcher asked for, while simultaneously doing what he could until they arrived. Dr. Laura Keaton met them at the hospital and ran the initial assessment, while Malcolm stood outside the curtained area and waited, still in his damp jacket, his right sock wet from the broken shoe. Dr. Keaton came out and told him what the scan showed. The valve had deteriorated faster than the previous projections. Lila would need surgery within 72 hours. The cost estimate was close to $90,000. Malcolm's current insurance coverage had lapsed the previous month, when his hours at the warehouse had been cut below the threshold required to maintain the company plan. Malcolm sat down on a chair in the hallway and looked at his phone. He started making calls. By 2 a.m, he had spoken to a bank, 2 community assistance organizations, and 4 people he knew well enough to call. The bank required documentation he couldn't produce by morning. The community organizations had wait lists and caps. The 4 people he'd called had helped him before in smaller ways, and couldn't help him now in a larger one. His employer at the warehouse called at 7 a.m. to tell him he was being let go. He'd missed his shift the previous night without calling in, and this was the second time in 3 months. Malcolm said he understood and thanked the supervisor, because it cost him nothing to be decent about it, and because he had been taught, and had taught Lila, that you treated people correctly even when the situation didn't warrant it from them. He sat in the hospital cafeteria with a cup of coffee he couldn't really afford and thought about what remained. A car arrived outside at 9:15, and the driver handed him an envelope containing a note from Theodore Grant, asking if Malcolm would be willing to come and see him that morning. Theodore Grant's house looked different in the morning than it had in the rain. Malcolm noticed the gate, the camera above it, the quiet of the block. He noticed, in the way that people notice things when they're already operating at the edge of their available attention, that the house had the particular solidity of something that had been paid for completely a long time ago. The caretaker let him in. Theodore was sitting in a study off the main hallway, not a formal room, more a working space, with a desk and 2 chairs that had been used enough to have shapes in them. He looked considerably better than he had the night before. He looked like what he was, a man in his mid-70s who had managed a health crisis, and returned to a baseline that still functioned well. Theodore had spent the morning on the phone. He told Malcolm this directly. Without preamble, he had verified Malcolm's employment history, his address, Lila's medical record, and the current status of the eviction notice. He said he hoped Malcolm didn't find that intrusive, and he said it in a way that made clear he had considered the possibility and had decided to do it anyway because he needed to understand the full picture before he said what he intended to say. Malcolm said it wasn't intrusive. What Theodore offered was specific. He would cover the cost of Lila's surgery. He would pay the arrears that had generated the eviction notice and hold the tenancy stable while Malcolm found his footing. He would connect Malcolm with a program that provided certification training in building management and maintenance, and he would arrange a temporary relocation to a cleaner, safer unit while Lila recovered, because her recovery environment mattered and the current apartment's condition was not adequate for it. Malcolm sat with all of this for a moment. Then he said he was concerned that he was being turned into a charity case for someone to feel good about. Theodore said he understood the concern and that it was a reasonable one. He said he wasn't paying Malcolm back for carrying him 2 miles in the rain, because that wasn't a transaction. It was something Malcolm had done because it needed doing, and transactionalizing it would change what it was. What he was doing instead was addressing a set of circumstances that had produced an unjust outcome for a person who hadn't caused those circumstances, and he was doing it because he had the capacity to address them, and because not doing so was a choice he wasn't willing to make. Malcolm said he'd accept the help for Lila's surgery. He wasn't ready to say yes to the rest of it, while he was still sitting in someone else's chair trying to absorb the morning. Theodore said that was fine, and that the surgery would be taken care of that day. Victor Hale had worked for Grant Urban Holdings for 11 years, and in that time he had developed a precise understanding of what the company actually cared about, versus what it said it cared about in its public materials? The answer, as far as Victor could determine, was occupancy rates and liability avoidance. If the units were occupied and nothing was going wrong in a way that generated paperwork, his work was considered satisfactory. This had given him considerable latitude, which he had used in the ways that people use latitude when no one is checking. Maintenance requests that fell through the cracks, fees that appeared on statements without a corresponding service, pressure applied to tenants who complained, documentation that was technically present but reflected a reality that didn't exist. When Victor found out that Theodore Grant, the founder, nominally retired for 6 years, was taking a personal interest in a tenant named Malcolm Reed, Victor understood what that meant. Someone was going to look at the building. Someone was going to look at his files. 11 years of calibrated corner cutting was going to be reviewed by people who had not been paid to look the other way. He couldn't let that happen. The story he constructed was not complicated, because the most effective lies aren't complicated, they're plausible extensions of existing facts. Malcolm Reed was a man in debt who had entered a wealthy man's home. That was true. The wealthy man had experienced a medical episode the same night, leaving him confused and disoriented. Also true. For the missing item, Victor chose a vintage watch he had seen listed in a household insurance document that had passed through the property management system 2 years earlier. During a routine correspondence, the kind of peripheral access to information that accumulates over a decade in a management role, stored in the back of memory for no particular purpose, until it suddenly has one. He filed the report before checking with Theodore, counting on the gap between the report and the verification. He was counting, specifically, on how the system processed a call reporting theft and elder exploitation when the alleged perpetrator was a black man with debt, no current income, and an eviction notice on file. He had seen the system process similar cases before. He was not wrong about the pattern. He was wrong about the camera, but he didn't know he was wrong about it yet. Victor called the police from his office phone, which was recorded as a matter of standard procedure, because all calls to and from the property management system were logged and archived. This was a policy that had been in place for 9 years, and that Victor knew about intellectually the same way a person knows about a lot of things they don't actually think about when they're executing a plan quickly. The 2 officers came to the hospital on a Tuesday morning. Lila was awake and watching her father when they knocked on the open door. The officers explained the allegation. Malcolm said he understood what they were telling him, and that he hadn't taken anything from Theodore Grant's home, and that Theodore Grant had invited him in, and was, as far as Malcolm knew, grateful for his presence there. The officers said they needed to bring him in for questioning. Malcolm asked if he could stay until a hospital staff member could be present with Lila. One of the officers said that would have to be sorted out at the station. Malcolm looked at Lila. He kept his expression level because she was watching him, and because she had the same instinct he did for reading the room, and if he showed her what he was actually feeling, it would frighten her in a way that would affect her cardiac readings. He told her he was going to go talk to some people and that everything was going to be fine and that the nurses knew where he was. He said it in the voice he used when something was true and when something needed to be true simultaneously. Lila moved to get up. The monitoring equipment registered the increase in cardiac activity within seconds, and Dr. Heaton was in the doorway within 30 seconds of that, redirecting Lila back to the bed with the efficient calm of someone who had managed this kind of situation before. Malcolm was already in the hallway with the officers. The people in the hallway watched him be escorted out in the particular way that people watch those things, some with curiosity, some with the quick judgment that comes from reading the surface of a situation. At the police station, Malcolm was placed in an interview room and told that Detective Karen Briggs would be with him shortly. He had been in difficult situations before. He had built a life for himself and for Lila in the constant presence of that kind of situation, and he had done it by staying practical and not spending energy on the parts he couldn't affect. He sat in the interview room and thought about what was actually within his control, and the list was very short, and the first item on it was to keep telling the truth in a way that was clear and consistent and didn't require embellishment. The second item was to trust that the cameras had recorded what they had recorded. Detective Briggs came in 45 minutes later. She laid out the allegation: theft of a vintage watch from the home of an elderly man during what could be characterized as an unauthorized entry. Malcolm told her the entry had been at Theodore's invitation, that he had helped the man with his medication, and that he had left without taking anything. Briggs said they would need to verify his account, and that until verification was complete, he would need to remain. Victor had provided the alleged inventory discrepancy in a written statement submitted through the property management company's system, which gave it a layer of institutional legitimacy. He had also provided the eviction documentation, the employment termination, and a timeline that positioned Malcolm as someone desperate enough to act. The picture it painted was not accurate, but it was internally coherent, which was enough for the process to continue running. Back at the hospital, Dr. Keaton was working around the specific problem of a patient who needed a surgical consent form signed by her sole guardian, who was not accessible. The surgery was already scheduled. Theodore had authorized the payment that morning, but several components of the preoperative protocol required signatures that Keaton couldn't generate on Malcolm's behalf. She could proceed on emergency authority if Lila's condition became immediately life-threatening, but the current presentation didn't yet meet that threshold. She contacted the hospital's legal department. Family Services began the process of identifying a temporary emergency guardian, which moved at the speed of administrative process rather than medical urgency. Meanwhile, Victor was at the apartment building, overseeing what he had scheduled as a routine maintenance inspection, a category that gave him access to the units without tenant permission. What he actually wanted was documentation of the unit's condition that would support an accelerated eviction finding and access to the space before anyone from Theodore's organization started asking questions about the building's management history. Malcolm was in a police interview room. Lila's paperwork was stalled. Victor was in his apartment. Victor was a man who had spent 11 years studying how people run out of capacity. He had run the calculation correctly in almost every variable. He had not calculated for Theodore Grant making a phone call. Theodore had spent the morning on the phone with Daniel Foster, his attorney of 22 years, walking him through the full situation before the officers had even reached the hospital. Daniel understood immediately what was needed: the security footage, a formal affidavit from Theodore confirming the facts of the evening, and immediate presence at the station. He prepared the affidavit by phone with Theodore, had it notarized by an on-call notary. His firm kept available for exactly the kind of situation that couldn't wait for business hours, and was in his car with the tablet containing the footage within the hour. He arrived at the station 12 minutes after Theodore made his second call, this one directly to the department's main line, identifying himself by name and asking to speak with whoever was handling the case of Malcolm Reed. The detective who took that call had been at a city infrastructure meeting 2 years prior, where Theodore's company had been a major topic of conversation. Names from those meetings stayed with you. The detective received Theodore's call 11 minutes before Daniel Foster walked through the station's front door. Daniel presented the material to Detective Briggs in the station's conference room and walked through the footage in sequence. The first clip showed Malcolm approaching the gate with Theodore on his back. The second showed Theodore opening the gate from the inside, his hand on the panel, his body oriented toward Malcolm in the posture of someone welcoming rather than someone being maneuvered. The third showed the interior hallway, Malcolm helping Theodore to the cabinet, Theodore directing him, Malcolm handing over the medication, then sitting down. The fourth clip, time-stamped 41 minutes later, showed Malcolm picking up his jacket, exchanging words with the caretaker who had just arrived, and walking out through the front door. The vintage watch was visible on Theodore's wrist in the third clip and the fourth. Briggs watched all 4 clips without speaking. Then she asked Daniel if Theodore was available by phone. Theodore confirmed what the footage showed in the direct, unhurried manner of someone who had been answering questions from people in authority for most of his adult life, and had never found it necessary to perform urgency on their behalf. Briggs said she would process the release. She said the investigation of the complaint would continue, meaning the complaint itself, and the circumstances under which it was filed. Malcolm was brought out to the front area of the station at shortly after 1 in the afternoon. Daniel introduced himself and explained, briefly and without editorializing, what had happened and what had been provided. Malcolm said thank you. Then he asked if there was a car available, because he needed to get back to the hospital. What followed happened in the span of 48 hours, and not all of it involved Malcolm directly. The police department's internal process for reviewing a false police report began the same afternoon. The recording from Victor Hale's call was retrieved. The property management system's logging protocol had captured it in full, including Victor's specific language about the watch and his characterization of Malcolm's entry as unauthorized, both of which the footage directly contradicted. The detective assigned to the review noted that Victor had named a specific missing item, provided a specific valuation, and identified a specific suspect within hours of the alleged theft, a level of specificity inconsistent with a report made in good faith based on incomplete information. Grant Urban Holdings was notified through its board that the founder had requested an emergency review of building operations in the Greenfield district, specifically the property managed by Victor Hale. The board convened 2 days after Malcolm's release. Theodore did not attend in person. He was still managing his recovery, but Daniel Foster presented on his behalf, and the materials he brought were extensive. 11 years of maintenance records were reviewed alongside the actual state of the units documented in an independent assessor's inspection. The gap between the two was not subtle. Hundreds of service requests had been marked as resolved when no service had been performed. Fee line items appeared on tenant statements without corresponding services. The building's safety inspection certifications for the past 4 years reflected conditions that the independent documentation contradicted. Victor had not been sloppy about it. The falsification was methodical and consistent, but it had been done under the assumption that no one would ever conduct an independent comparison. The review also surfaced a pattern of eviction filings against tenants who had filed complaints, including several families whose departures had preceded rent increases. And it surfaced the eviction notice against Malcolm Reed, generated 2 weeks after a late payment by a tenant who had been consistently on time for the preceding 31 months and who had experienced a documented medical crisis with his child. Victor Hale was called into a board meeting on the 3rd day and presented with the findings. He sat across from 4 board members, Daniel Foster, and an HR director he had never met. He said that the maintenance records reflected the resources allocated to him, that the fees were consistent with the company's policies, and that the eviction filing against Malcolm Reed was standard procedure for accounts in arrears. Theodore, joining by phone, said that Malcolm Reed had carried him 2 miles in the rain with broken shoes and had refused payment because he considered it the wrong framing for what he'd done. He said he was aware that Victor had filed a false police report that had resulted in Malcolm being removed from his daughter's hospital room while she was awaiting surgery. He said that the decision of what to do with Victor was for the board to make, but that he wanted the record to be clear. Victor was dismissed at the end of the meeting. His access credentials to all Grant Urban Holdings properties were revoked before he left the building. The materials were forwarded to the appropriate municipal offices for review of the false report filing and the fraudulent service documentation. The eviction filings he had processed in violation of the company's own internal policies were identified and referred to legal for individual review and reversal. Where applicable, Lila's surgery took 4 hours and 20 minutes. Dr. Keaton came out to the waiting area and told Malcolm that the procedure had gone as planned, that the valve repair was successful, and that Lila would need several weeks of recovery before returning to normal activity, but that the projections going forward were considerably better than they had been. Malcolm was sitting in a plastic chair in the waiting area when Keaton told him this. He had the posture of someone who had been operating past their capacity for an extended period and had been doing it by narrowing their attention down to the next essential thing and not looking beyond that. When Keaton finished, he put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands and stopped holding himself at the level of function that the previous 48 hours had required. He was allowed in to see Lila an hour later. She was awake and groggy and told him his jacket had a stain on it that he probably hadn't noticed. He said he'd look into it. Theodore's offer, revisited when Malcolm was no longer managing an acute crisis, took the shape that makes sense for something accepted by a person who doesn't want to be indebted and isn't willing to pretend otherwise. Malcolm accepted the surgery cost coverage because Lila's life had depended on it. He accepted the eviction resolution because the eviction had been generated by a false complaint filed with institutional weight against him, and reversing a wrong wasn't the same as receiving charity. He accepted the temporary unit reassignment because Lila's recovery required a clean and stable environment, and because Theodore had pointed out, accurately, that the current unit had conditions that Malcolm had been requesting repairs that Victor had logged as completed without completing. What he didn't accept was the job offer. Theodore had raised it again in a brief phone call, framing it in terms of Malcolm's qualifications rather than his gratitude. Malcolm said he understood the distinction, but that he couldn't start a position, knowing it had come to him through a personal connection, forged in extreme circumstances, because he wouldn't be able to separate the two, and that separation mattered to him. He asked if the certification program Theodore had mentioned was available through a standard application process. Theodore said it was. Malcolm said he would apply. He applied. He was accepted. He completed the certification in the time it took Lila to recover enough to return to school, working through the material in the evenings after she was in bed, the same schedule he had always kept. The assessment at the end was conducted by an independent evaluator who did not know his name had been connected to Theodore Grant's in any context. He scored in the upper range of the cohort. The position he was offered, housing quality supervisor, with a focus on low-income residential properties in the Greenfield district, was posted publicly, and he applied through the posted process. He was hired. Victor Hale's situation resolved through the processes to which it had been referred, at the speed that such processes move. The false police report generated a formal investigation. The fraudulent maintenance documentation generated a separate one. The pattern of retaliatory eviction filings was reviewed by the City Housing Authority. Not all of these processes concluded in the same year, but they were moving, and the direction was not something Victor could redirect. The families whose evictions had been improperly generated were identified through the review process. The fees collected without corresponding services were calculated across the full period of Victor's management and included in a structured repayment to current and former tenants. Grant Urban Holdings undertook the building repairs that the independent assessment had identified as outstanding with a documented schedule that could be audited. Malcolm's first year in the new position involved a lot of files. He reviewed maintenance records and service logs and eviction histories, and he developed, over time, a particular skill for identifying the gap between what had been documented and what had actually happened, a skill that he had had in a different form for most of his life, applied now to a system rather than to a specific set of circumstances. He brought several cases to the attention of building management. He brought 2 cases to the City Housing Authority directly, when the building management response was insufficient. Both resulted in findings. He was good at the work in the way that people are good at work that connects to something they already understood. Theodore and Lila had their first chess game 4 months after the surgery, at the table in his study, while Malcolm sat nearby reading a report he'd brought from the office. Theodore played the way a person plays when they want the game to continue rather than end, which meant he lost in 40 moves instead of the 20 that would have been available to him. Lila accepted the win without comment and reset the board. Theodore established a support program the following year through the company's community foundation. It provided emergency financial assistance to single-parent households, navigating serious pediatric illness, covering gaps in insurance coverage, medication costs, and the kind of incidental expense that accumulates around a child's illness in ways that don't fit into any standard aid category. The program operated without participant photography, without named sponsorship displays, and without any requirement that participants explain how they had come to need the assistance. Theodore described it to the foundation board as the kind of help that doesn't make the person receiving it feel observed. The program was not named after anyone. Malcolm drove to the district's East Quadrant on a Tuesday morning in December, about 14 months after the evening at the bus stop. He had a file review scheduled at a building on Carver Street and another meeting at noon. He parked on the street outside the first building, turned off the engine, and was collecting his bag from the passenger seat when he saw the older man. He was standing on the far sidewalk, one hand against the brick wall of a laundromat, trying to make a phone call and having difficulty, the kind that looks like the phone isn't cooperating but is actually the difficulty of cold hands. He had the stillness of someone who wasn't sure where to direct the next step. Malcolm got out of the car. Here is the thing that Victor Hale never understood about Malcolm Reed. Victor's whole system ran on one assumption, that people with nothing to fight back with eventually stop fighting. He had built 11 years of shortcuts on that foundation, and in most cases, he was right. Most people in Malcolm's position do eventually stop, not because they give up, but because the system is designed to outlast their capacity to keep showing up. What Victor didn't account for was a man who had been carrying things alone for so long that the act of carrying one more thing, one elderly stranger, 2 miles in the rain, with shoes that were already splitting, didn't register as an extraordinary choice. It was just the next thing that needed doing. The outcome of this story wasn't random luck. It followed directly from who Malcolm was before anyone knew his name. He helped Theodore because he was the kind of person who helped not when it was easy, not when it was strategic, but when it was the only thing in front of him that made sense. That quality, that consistency, was what created the chain of events that followed. Victor's machinery was built to defeat desperation. It had no mechanism for integrity that didn't know it was being tested. Most of us will never carry a billionaire home in the rain, but most of us have had the moment where something needed doing and we were the only one in the room who could see it, and we had to decide whether to step forward or wait for someone more qualified. Malcolm stepped forward, not for a reward, not for recognition, just because a person needed help and the bus wasn't coming. That's the story, and if it stayed with you, subscribe to this channel and come back. There are more of them about people who did the right thing when they had nothing left to give, and about what happened when the world finally caught up to who they had always been. You're not alone in whatever brought you here. The work you're doing in quiet, when no one is counting it, is still real. It still matters. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes it opens a door you never knew you were standing in front of.